Welcome to Novelist Spotlight. This is Mike Consul, your host. In addition to being the host of this podcast and interviewing novelists, I am a novelist myself. I have 3 published novels. My latest is titled Lolita Firestone, a supernatural novel, and it is set in Sedona, Arizona and Cairo, Egypt. My previous novel is titled Family Recipes, a novel about Italian culture, Catholic guilt, and the culinary crime of the century. And my first novel is named Hardwood, a novel about college basketball and other games young men play. And that story deals with issues ranging from depression and racism to sex, religion, and university politics. All 3 novels are listed in the episode notes. I hope you will buy them, I hope you will read them, and I hope you will thoroughly enjoy them. Now, on with our program.
In the spotlight is Scott Lord. He is a longtime Los Angeles trial lawyer, as well as a writer and librettist. Librettist as an opera. He graduated with honors from the University of California at Santa Cruz and from Santa Clara University School of Law, where he was a member of the Law Review. He has practiced criminal and civil law for 35 years and is still active in the legal field. Many of the characters and situations in his fiction are inspired by people and cases he encountered during his long career. He's also a serious student of Italian language and literature and a devoted opera lover. He and his wife, Susan, are parents of 6 children and live in Santa Monica, California. His first novel, The Logic Bomb, a legal thriller, was published in 2015, but he's got a new one out. The new one is titled Come November. It's a historical thriller with a love story at the center. The story is set in November 1947. 2 newspaper journalists fall in love as they travel from Chicago to New York to witness the momentous vote of the United Nations to partition Palestine and create the State of Israel. When they discover an assassination plot meant to swing the outcome, they must put their personal lives on hold and race the clock to stop it. Scott Lord, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate your introduction.
You bet. Thank you for taking the time. Let me ask you about the passion, your passion and understanding for opera. Just how much does it feed your fiction writing? Does it feed it in any way?
Oh, I think it does for sure. I'm half Italian, and I sort of grew up in a home where classical music and opera was being played pretty frequently by my parents and grandparents. And there's a certain passion that most operas have, as well as with the better ones, of course, are a really economical way with telling a story. It may not seem economical because some operas can go fairly long, but the stories are usually pretty simple. And it really helps, I think, for a writer or anyone who's creating a story to have studied those types of works.
So talk about opera a little bit more, just in terms of what do most people not get about opera? Because opera does not have a huge fan base, just as classical music, once did but doesn't today. There's obviously some elements to it that's lost on people. I mean, the Italian language, so from that standpoint, you're actually understanding what they're saying. That's not always the case with people in the seats. What is it that people don't get? Is it the disconnect on the language, or are there other elements to this? And in fact, do you even need to know the Italian language to appreciate opera?
Well, years ago, it was at least necessary to study the story ahead of time, unless you were multilingual. Most of the popular operas are, as you say, in Italian. So a lot are in French and German, some in Russian. Some even in lesser known languages. So I think, at least in the U.S., that's certainly been part of the barrier for people is going and simply not being able to understand what's being said. But a number of years ago, they came up with super titles, and so and over the resistance of many people who were old school fans, they now have them in almost every opera theater in the world. So it's very easy to follow. Most of the librettos, most of the words are not that complicated. It's I love you, I hate you, when am I going to see you next kind of thing. So you can really sort of focus on the music and the singers before you. So I think that's a help. I'd have to say that I know when I was a kid, there was a lot more education, music education, and I do feel that that's something that's sort of gone downhill over the years in public schools, especially, that there's much less music education and people just aren't exposed to it. And when you first hear it, it seems weird. So I think that's you put those together and it makes it a bit of a hard sell for a popular medium.
Now, did you grow up in a household where you learned the Italian language? It was spoken as well as English, or was opera the motivation to learning Italian?
The second, as I got more into opera, as I got older, and got a chance to travel to Italy, it was more that I was able to. I thought, gee, it would be nice to be able to speak it, but also nice to be able to understand it when people speak. So I think that was more the motivation. I didn't grow up in a household where my parents spoke it, although my grandparents did occasionally, but I never learned it really at that age.
One more thing about opera,
Sure.
some people might say it's melodramatic. Books can be melodramatic, fiction can be melodramatic. Some people might say opera is melodramatic. What would you say to that?
I'd say that that's true. You're taking a normal event and you're dramatizing it, and then once you add music, it almost inevitably deepens the emotions, and so it can seem quite melodramatic to people. What a lot of people don't know who read about or learn about opera a little bit is there are many new operas being produced all the time, and a lot of the newer operas, of course, especially in the US, are in English. They're on modern subjects that people would find interesting, and they're of varying quality. There's some I see that just knock me out. And I think, boy, we have to add this to the repertoire. And then there's others, of course, that aren't quite as successful. But I'm sure it was that way back in the 19th century and before as well. Some were hits, some were misses.
Yeah, interesting. I didn't know that. Okay, well, interesting. So what about fiction writing? What motivated you to begin writing fiction?
I've always wanted to write from really a fairly young age. And I remember being 13 or 14 and thinking, well, I'm old enough to write a novel. I've certainly got enough experience. I think what motivates most writers is that they're readers. And from a very young age, I was an omnivorous reader. Generally, anything that was in front of me, I'd give it a try. And so then at some point, I think I started wanting to tell stories as well as consume them. And over the years, I've had the chance to do that. And I think partly that sort of blended in with being a lawyer. As a trial lawyer, what you're really doing is telling a story. And you're putting on a presentation, and it can be as elaborate as you think might be necessary to win the case. And so I always thought of myself as a storyteller. Of course, working full-time as a lawyer, you don't have quite as much time to write as you might otherwise wish. But when 10 or 15 years ago, I reduced my caseload significantly, I was able to start writing, and it's been a real pleasure.
So I was going to say that lawyers do a lot of writing. You tell stories in the courtroom because you're a trial lawyer, as you were saying, but you also do a lot of writing, although it's a very different kind of writing. As a journalist over the years, I've noticed there's a lot of lawyers who are interested in writing, actually interested in maybe becoming journalists. They never like the idea of taking the pay cut, so most of them never transitioned over to journalism. But it does seem that people who are attracted to law tend to be people who are also attracted to writing. Is that your experience as well? I don't mean personally, but when you look at the industry,
Sure.
the legal field, is it? Yes. Okay.
There's certainly a number of lawyers who have gone on to become authors of varying degrees of success. And obviously you can think of John Grisham or Scott Turow, who've had tremendous success, who came out of the legal field. Scott Turow especially was really a terrific lawyer and continued practicing even after he started writing bestsellers. I think there's, as you say, there are some similarities, especially if you're a trial lawyer, because you do write a lot and you do talk a lot, and it certainly becomes a similar hopefully if you're in trial and you're trying to tell the truth, it's not a work of fiction. But I have to tell you, when I did criminal cases, often there wasn't much of a defense, and you did have to be creative to try to get the jury to see things your way.
Right, right. So interesting. So you're in the courtroom, you're talking to a jury, you're telling a story. Jurors are of various backgrounds, educational levels. Some focus well, some don't. I suspect you were very focused on making sure that the story you're telling was easy to understand, was simplistic to the degree that it spoke to each one of those jurors.
Right.
How much of that, when you actually sit down to write your novels, how big a calculus is that? Or do you tend to think, look, if people are picking up books and reading, they have a certain ability to focus, and they're looking for a certain level of complexity. They're looking to entangle some things, and so on. And of course, there's different kinds of novels, but the type you write, they're looking for a payoff at the end, I would imagine.
Yeah, I think that's true, Mike. I have to say that I've published 2 novels, and I have 2 other I've written but haven't been published yet. And with all 4 of them, I've usually work out the ending before I really start writing the book. And quite often that's what motivates me to write the rest of the novel, is that I've thought of this, I've thought the story through, and I've figured out how it can come to a satisfying conclusion. Sometimes for the Logic Bomb, for instance, I actually wrote the last couple of chapters before I started from the beginning, because those just sort of came to me, and I thought, boy, that seems like a really good way to end the story. Now let's figure out what the rest of the story is.
Interesting. So, okay, you'll write the end. You know where you're going. You've got a destination in mind. That's a motivating factor for you. So, do you plot out the whole book? One, because you've decided on the ending, but do you allow the journey to be organic to reach that ending, or do you plot it out to make sure that you don't end up veering off course and spend 6 or 7 years writing a book that should have taken 2 or 3?
Yes, and that certainly can happen. To answer your question, I tend to write what I regard as a roadmap, more or less an outline, but to leave a lot of breathing room, because I find that as I write the story, things happen. A character who I thought was going to be a minor character sort of takes on a life of his or her own. And I think, oh, well, I should write more about that character because they're really interesting, and I could make them a more interesting part of the story. When you write a thriller, of course, and to some extent, Come November is a thriller, as was The Logic Bomb, plotting is important. So you do have to at least note out the plot points that you're going to hit, the ups, the downs of the characters, the dangers that they might experience, those sorts of things, so you don't quite get lost. Otherwise, as you say, you can chase a lot of rabbits down the wrong holes and end up taking 2 or 3 times as long as you want to write the story.
Now, you had mentioned Scott Turow. He came out, exploded on the scene with Presumed Innocent, was also made into a movie, and a good movie at that.
It was.
So he really, I mean, check me on this, Scott, but I think it was Scott Turow who really kind of launched the legal thriller field, or at least the modern legal thriller field. And you have written a legal thriller, The Logic Bomb, but your second one is more historical thriller. At least that's how it's labeled. So you're not necessarily looking to write in the legal thriller genre, or are you?
No, for my first book, it just came naturally. Especially you had noted that I did a fair amount of criminal law, though I don't really do that anymore. And one of the pleasures of doing criminal law, besides representing people and trying to succeed in their cases, is you hear incredible stories that you, for the most part, you just don't hear in the civil field. And so when it came time to write that book, I had characters I'd met. I had some really, what I thought were really cool stories to tell. And I was able to weave those in with the more or less sort of thriller plot that The Logic Bomb ended up being.
Interesting. I noticed that the Logic Bomb is not on your website. Come November is.
Right.
Then, by the way, listeners, scottlord.com will take you to the website where you can learn more about Scott. But why is the Logic Bomb not there?
I had a different website for the Logic Bomb, and since it was so long ago, I didn't want to, I don't know, I guess sort of split the readers or people who would go to the website's focus. And so I wanted the new website I created when this book was published a couple months ago to really just highlight Come November.
Now, and we'll talk about Come November in a little bit, but your take on it. But I'm curious as to you've written 4 novels, 2 are published. The 2 that are not published, is that a situation, that typical situation where an agent or an editor said, we don't really want to publish that one. That one's not ready for prime time, or that's not a channel that we need to fill. We already got an author in that channel, that sort of thing. Or are you still working on them?
Well, with one of them, it's what you'd said, which is that I haven't been able to get a publisher interested in it. One of them, I think I've decided it was not ready for prime time. It was a novel I wrote right after The Logic Bomb, and in some ways was sort of a sequel to it. But for my own judgment, it didn't quite come together enough. So it's not one that I've submitted to anybody. It's sitting there, and I might go back and work on it sometime. But at this point, I don't have any plans to try to get it out there.
So what can you tell us about the 2 that are not published? Are those ones that you don't want to discuss what the themes are, or is it okay to give us a sketch?
I don't mind at all. The one that I like, it's called Drop the Hammer, and it's a story, sort of a modern story of more a Hollywood story. As a lawyer in Los Angeles, over the years, I've come to know a fair number of people that are in the entertainment business. And so I thought there was people I knew, actors, producers, directors, that I thought, well, it'd be interesting to tell a story with those characters, because there are some real characters in the business. And so I came up with a story and a plot about an actress and a producer who get involved in trying to produce their own movie independently. And it sort of goes through the various ups and downs that those two encounter. And at its base, it too is kind of a love story as well. So it's a book I really like. I haven't been able to convince anyone else of that yet, but it is out there. The other book, which I'm not, as I say, not quite ready for prime time, as I said, was a bit of a sequel to The Logic Bomb, same main character, but I never was happy with the story, with the plot, and basically it involved a businessman who got in a lot of trouble, got involved in some things with some organized crime figures, and asked the main character, who's a lawyer, to represent them. But as I say, you work on something for 6 months or a year, and sometimes you have to look at it and say, there's something not quite right about this, or it's not working, and cut your losses.
You mentioned the same character as The Logic Bomb, same protagonist.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel about genre writing? Because there are clearly people who read a lot within a particular genre that they love. There's
Yes.
authors who do well with that, but then on the other hand, you can get tired of a character. If I've got the same character that I'm carrying from novel to novel, say it's a detective maybe,
Mm-hmm.
Or ensemble of characters. Does that appeal to you, being a genre writer, or do you want more latitude than that and feel that maybe thrillers are your thing, but you don't want it to be in one particular genre?
I certainly enjoy genre novels. Over the years, have been a huge fan of detective stories, a huge fan of spy novels. I love John Le Carré, for instance, and his series of novels. And certainly I've read almost every kind of detective fiction that you can think of, from the old 30s and 40s private eye type stories to more modern ones, such as Mike Connolly's Harry Bosch, stories like those. for whatever reason, that's not been the path that I've chosen. I like my characters when I write them, but when I think of writing a new book, I don't normally think of, oh, well, let me stick this character in a new situation. Though I know that can be very popular, and obviously certain people have done very well with that. And I think Scott Turow is a good example. He created, as you say, with Presumed Innocent, a real blockbuster. And he's returned to the characters in that a couple of times over the years. But for the most part, he did almost like Faulkner did. He created a venue, a county, an area, and he's continued to explore different characters in that particular venue, as opposed to going back again and again to the same character. I do think people tend to like genre novels because at its core, I mean, when you go to read fiction, you want to be entertained. And once a writer has proven to you that he or she can entertain you, you do tend to go back to him. I certainly do myself.
You mentioned a love story earlier, and there's a love story at the center of Come November.
Yeah.
So often it seems that is absolutely key. I mean, even when I went to see the movie Malcolm X, which is a nonfiction story, but they put the relationship between Malcolm X and his wife, the love story that was there, at the center of that movie very much. It almost seems that without that element, without some kind of romance within a story, that it's somehow for a lot of people it's deficient. How important do you think it is? I mean, obviously you've written that into your latest novel, and you've looked and that's been your instinct in at least one previous one. So is that something that you would think in terms of including anytime you're telling a story, because it has just story so often hinges on something like a romantic entanglement?
The answer is yes. I like anybody, and it's certainly not a revelation that love is an important emotion in almost everyone's life, and so much of our own personal stories have to do with the people in our life that we've loved, whether it's family or husband or wife or significant others. I think it is central. And when I tell a story, to me, and it sounds a little schmaltzy, but I like it to have heart. And I think there is a universality to telling love stories. My experience of a love or a relationship might be different than yours or some of my readers, but there's enough similarities that people can sometimes find themselves or recognize the situations. And I think it adds to the interest of a story to have people you care about and who care about each other and go through the various vicissitudes that people do when you're in love.
When you made the decision to write fiction, what did you do to prepare? I mean, there's a lot of people who read and say, I enjoy reading, so I want to write. You had indicated that earlier, but and some of them just jump straight into it. I can do this. But then others go through some certain paces to really prepare themselves, book expos, writing courses, writing groups, and so on. What did you do? Or did you just jump straight into it?
I certainly early on just jumped straight into it. Certainly in college, I took writing courses in addition to the other courses I had to take or that were part of my major. So I did take creative writing courses. I guess I liken it, as you say, a lot of people read and then sometimes conclude that means they're able to write. And I liken that to people who go to restaurants and really enjoy eating, who then think they could own and run a restaurant.
Right.
So I think training and studying and making efforts to write and making all the mistakes you make when you're first starting something are essential. I'm certain there's probably born writers, just as there were born musicians, people who could write music or create music from an early age. But I think for most people, I think training is really essential, and it doesn't have to be formal. I mean, I certainly took courses over the course of my career in writing and made a lot of efforts. But some of it you really learn. Some of the people who've taught me the most are the editors I've worked with. people who have edited God knows how many hundreds of books and really have a good command of how to create a style, how to tell a story, as well as the nuts and bolts of putting a sentence together. And so I've learned a lot from people who have helped me in the editing of my books as well.
How much research do you do in preparing to write your books or along the way? Because your latest one, come November, has to do with the establishment of Israel. It's got a historical basis there. So do you do a great deal of research on each of the books you've written, or was this one set apart in that way?
I did more research for Come November than any of my previous 3 books that I wrote. With The Logic Bomb, since it involved a lawyer and involved him going through various court proceedings as well as cases, there was a lot that I knew already. I didn't have to research. With Come November, and it involving a period that, of course, was before I was born, was involved probably about a year of research. I was able to spend a lot of time at libraries. I was able to spend time at the United Nations, in New York at the New York Historical Society, as well as the New York Public Library, which has a great collection of books and ability to research things that have taken place there. So for Come November, it was key. I'm no expert on the Middle East, on Israel, or any of the problems that have gone on there over the years. So I spent a lot of time reading books by people who did know, and then was able to start incorporating those. I trained as a historian. My undergraduate degree is in history. And so it really was important to me with Come November that the historical figures who were presented, both Israeli, Arab, others, were presented accurately, because I do present actual people who lived during that time, and that the details were right. One of the genres I like, we were talking about genres, is historical fiction. And one of those things that bug you, maybe, or bug me, maybe don't bug you, is when you're reading something and you either recognize immediately or through some other way learn, this isn't accurate. That's not how it happened. That battle took place in 1942, 1943. So I was very concerned about accuracy, and also about accurately presenting the historical figures. There's one historical figure who was by the name of Moshe Sharett, who was the first foreign minister and second prime minister of Israel. And he was sort of a key figure during the 1947 vote to partition Palestine on behalf of what they then called the Zionist movement. And so I wrote him in, and I'd studied his diaries and his history and biographies. But then when I was pretty close to putting the novel in final form, I discovered his children were still alive, although in their 90s. And so just out of respect, I wrote and said, gee, would you care to read this before I publish it, just to make sure that I've accurately portrayed your father? And his daughter, Yael Medini, was kind enough to email with me and spent a couple of months going through my manuscript and gave me just invaluable pointers, not just about her father, but she had lived through that time, and was able to really set me straight on a couple of things. So to answer your question, I think if you are going to do historical fiction writing, and Come November is certainly in that genre, I think you have to do your work, your homework, before you get started.
Yeah, and getting live sources like that, living sources to tell the parts of the story that you didn't have access to previously. That's gold right there.
It really was, down to the hotel they stayed at on the day of the vote. And I want to note, before we go too much further, I know we've been going on a while. Today is November 29th, and the vote to partition Palestine, and which led to the creation of Israel in 1947, took place on November 29th. So it's a pretty appropriate day to be recording this podcast.
That's interesting. And also another timing issue here is that Come November sounds well timed, because right now, with all that's going on in Israel and the Gaza Strip, in the discussions about the only way they're going to have peace is a separate Palestinian state and so on. The book sounds very well timed, because the interest level is so high right now about what's going on over there. Talk about Come November, its origins, the plot, the protagonists. You just told a little bit about the research that went into it. Tell us about the story.
The story, I had actually started writing a novel. I had this idea of a woman in her early 70s who became the character Jean in Come November, taking a trip with her 40-year-old discontented son to Europe, and with the purpose from her mind of becoming closer to him, but also to reunite with someone who was someone she had had a relationship with when she was in her late teens. And so I was writing that story, and for some reason I had forgotten, or it just hadn't been in my mind, that my mother, when she was 17, took a trip from Chicago to the United Nations, much as Jean does in the novel. And she was part of a group of student editors. They were journalists, and the Chicago Sun, which later became the Sun Times, sponsored a trip for these students, 70 or 80 of them, to see the new United Nations and watch it in action. And she had created this scrapbook. And if someone does go on my website, they'll see some of the pictures from the Chicago Sun articles about the trip. And so the scrapbook came to my attention. One of my brothers showed it to me, and it suddenly sort of gelled. I thought I could tell the story of this older woman and her trip, but I could also relate it back to an earlier time when she had this adventure in New York, so to speak. Now, I created a love story. That wasn't something out of actual history, but it all sort of came together when I found out that the time my mother took the trip was in November 1947. And some of the committee meetings she went to and some of the General Assembly sessions did relate to the vote. She wasn't there the day of the vote, but did relate to that vote and to the issues of the creation of Israel.
Wow. What are you working on now, Scott?
I have to choose. I've got two books I'm working on. One is sort of a coming of age tale, which is a story of growing up here in Los Angeles, as I did in the late 60s and early 70s, and interrelates it with a lot of things that were going on at the time, including the Vietnam War, the space program, as well as the Cold War with Russia. And I'm about half done with that, and I continue to work on that. The second book I'm working on has to do with the Suez Crisis in 1956, which continues some of the same themes because, of course, it involved Arab peoples as Egypt, as well as Israel, but also was one of those situations that a lot of people have sort of forgotten because it was a long time ago, where the world sort of came to the brink of a nuclear crisis because a lot of what was going on in the Middle East at the time was a sort of as a proxy for the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. I'm about halfway through the research for that. I've started writing the outline, so that's probably a good year and a half away before I'll have that finished.
Before we talk more about writing, I'm curious about your decision to study law. What motivated you to study law?
That's one of I talked a little bit ago about people who were sort of born musicians or born writers or some other field. I, from a very early age, was attracted to the law. I'd read books, I'd see TV shows, whatever it might be. And it seemed like something that was appealing to me. There's a performative aspect, of course, to being a trial lawyer, which appealed to me. And then there's also, of course, the ability to use your intelligence or your skills or whatever it might be to help your clients. And that was a real attraction for me as well. And so although I went down a lot of byways growing up, as you do, I studied music, I studied acting, which I found very helpful as a trial lawyer. Eventually, as I was going through as an undergraduate, it seemed almost inevitable that I was going to go to law school, and I did, and got out of law school, hung up my shingle, and within a few weeks, I was trying criminal cases, and I loved it.
Wow. So you see these preposterous legal shows sometimes where an attorney's carrying on in the courtroom and the judge is just sitting there letting him or her get away with, verbal murder, basically. Were you chastened by judges along the way because you got a little too animated, a little too dramatic for his or her taste?
It certainly happens. It hasn't happened too frequently, fortunately, but there, just as there are in any relationship or any person you happen to meet, sometimes there's almost an instant dislike. And occasionally I've been in courtrooms where whatever I was selling, they weren't buying, and whatever they were doing, I thought, did this person even go to law school? And so, yeah, you can get crossways. It definitely happens more in criminal cases because the stakes are so high. Yes, in civil, you can be, the stakes can be hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, but at least if you lose your case, your client's not going to prison. So in the criminal world and criminal cases, you can certainly get into more dramatic situations. And yeah, I've definitely gotten crosswise with judges. I really try not to, because at the end of the day, they're the one that is going to help you win your case if it's handled right. So, but there are times where if a judge is wrong, you just have to stand up and tell them that's what you think. You try to do it without being offensive, but you do try to set them straight, which doesn't always lead to a pleasant conclusion.
What was your superpower in the courtroom? What characteristic did you have, or what technique did you have that really made you an effective trial attorney?
I think preparation is the key. I usually felt that when I got to court, when I was in trial, I knew my case backwards and forwards. I knew the other side's case. I tried to know the other side's case better than they knew it. And so being ready for that. The second thing I'd have to say was being sort of quick on my feet. As much as you plan out a trial and how you're going to present and how you're going to examine witnesses, inevitably there's an enormous amount of improvisation that comes up. A witness doesn't say what they said before. A witness comes up with something new. The judge prevents you from presenting some of the evidence you thought was going to be key. And so being able to be, as I say, quick on your feet, make an adjustment is absolutely key.
So those are maybe some of the marks of distinction in the courtroom for you. What are some of the marks of distinction in your writing that would tell a reader, I'm reading Scott Lord, that they don't even, they're just reading the copy and it's like, this is Scott Lord writing. Are there any elements to your writing or marks of distinction that you believe are there that kind of are markers for you?
That's a great question, and it can go two ways. It invites one to sort of be immodest about your abilities, but on the other hand, if I answer it straight, it's sort of an interesting way to look at your own work. I think the thing that distinguishes me, or which would get a reader excited to read something I've written, is I try to tell a story straight. With not simple words necessarily, but with fairly simple and clear presentations of characters' motivations, of the events that are taking place. And one of the things I think I do well, and obviously the readers can tell me different, is write dialogue. Once I start writing a conversation or an event with characters, I really enjoy the back and forth of two or three or however many people are in a scene talking and having that interplay. And it's one of the things I've really enjoyed writing, and I think it stands out.
What are the an aspiring author out there listening to you, if you were to say, here's a key or a couple of keys to good dialogue or effective dialogue, what would you tell them?
Well, it's like that old joke about composition. It should be, short enough to be interesting, but long enough to cover the subject. One of the things I think every writer makes, one of the mistakes I think every writer makes is not editing themselves ruthlessly enough. I think it was Faulkner who said that the editing process is killing your babies. And so
right.
I think when you write, and then, a lot of writing, of course, is rewriting. And so when you go back to go through your work, especially with dialogue, less is more. Almost always less is more. One of the editors I was privileged to work with on the first manuscript of Come November was Bob Rowe, who was the editor-in-chief at Newsweek, but at the time I was working with him, had gone on to another job. And he was superb. He could take a page and show me how to make that page a paragraph. Take a paragraph and show me how to make it a sentence, and take a 15-word sentence and cut it in half. And we went through what was then about 200,000 word novel, and we got it down to, it's more or less its present size, about 125,000 words, which is a good length, I think, for a novel.
Sure.
I like to say
that's a lot of words that were condensed then.
It is, and there were certainly some favorite children who I had to slay to get it down there, but almost all the time I would agree with him. I might not agree with him right away when he said, "I think you need to cut this, or you need to rearrange this." Sometimes he would be a little critical, which is what an editor should be. But once I spent a day or two and recovered my equilibrium, I'd go, "Oh man, he's right." And I was lucky enough, as I say, to work with Bob. And then when my publisher Greenleaf took on the manuscript, they had assigned another editor, and we went through it all yet again. And again, we're able to improve it, I think, substantially.
What is your muse? Do you have a muse, Scott? And if you do, what is your muse?
I've never really thought about that. I think if I have a muse, it's my favorite authors. So maybe not just one. We talked a little about being a lawyer, and I have to say that the side of me that writes fiction and creates stories and writes dialogue it seems like a different part of my brain than the part that writes a legal brief or analyzes a legal issue. And so I could be in the same seat at the same desk where I create a legal brief, but when I start to write a story, it's different. And I think part of it is in terms of inspiration, which is what I think of muse as, is the people I've read or the stories I've read, and that excites me. You can go see a movie, you can hear a piece of music, and it just makes you want to be creative. And so I think it's the inspiring work of other creators that I think inspires me.
When you search on Amazon for a book and you search Come November and that book comes up, or any book, it will say people who like this book also like these.
Yes.
So if somebody's on Come November, and I don't have it up in front of me on Amazon, I'm curious who you would name as an author or two that if you like Scott Lord, you also would like, or if you like these authors, you would like Scott Lord's writing. Name an author or two who you think I don't want to say emulate, but are simpatico with your writing.
Well, I think we've already discussed one, Scott Turow, who has a great ability, although he writes usually in the legal genre. He has a terrific ability to tell a story in a way that's literary. It's not genre writing where everything has to fit in place. And I think Jean Le Carré is the same, the writer of the George Smiley novels and a number of other spy type novels. They're literary authors who've chosen to work in the genre. And so I think if people enjoy their writing, I think they would enjoy mine. I can't say that I'm the same or similar or even in their class, and I'm trying to be a little modest here. But I have to say that when I finished The Logic Bomb and was getting ready to publish it, I sent it to Scott Turow, and I asked him to read it and give me what they call a blurb, a short sentence or two from a fellow author about your book. And I have to say he was kind enough to do that. So when I I was publishing The Logic Bomb. There was a blurb from Scott Turow imploring people to read my book. So I was pretty happy about that.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, that's a great blurb right there.
Was.
You mentioned literary, and that is one of the raps against genre writing, is that the vast bulk of genre writing tends to be all plot driven, not very literary. Now you mentioned Scott Turow, John le Carré, long known as a real craftsman with the language. That and as you were saying that, it made me think of John D. MacDonald, who wrote a ton of books.
Yep.
Genre writer. Then he went off, kind of off the reservation, if you will, on a couple of books. And those were the ones I really loved. A Key to the Sweet in particular was very literary. I mean, when I read that, I thought, well, I'm going to read all of his books. But then I realized, oh, this was one that he did on the side. It's kind of like, this is the kind of writing that I'm capable of doing, and maybe that I would like to do, but it's not going to sell as well as Travis McGee.
Right.
So, and I think that John Grisham also has done a book or two that was, if I didn't have to worry about making money, this is my words, not his. This is what I would be writing.
Right.
What about? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think when I say literary, I guess what I mean is as you were describing, writers who aren't just thinking of hitting the plot points and keeping the train moving, but also take the time maybe to explore a character a little deeper or a situation, and whose actual craftsmanship, the words they use, the sentences they write, are memorable, and not just a way to get you from point A to point B. And I think all of the writers we've been talking about do that. I love the Travis McGee novels for sure, but I know, as you say, when he sort of went off the reservation, he was also able to create some very interesting work. Another writer, LA writer, James Ellroy, who wrote LA Confidential and then a whole other series of books, is like that too, where sometimes he'll write something that, oh, I know this is going to be popular, and then other things that are almost like verbal jazz, where you have to work a little to appreciate it, but usually the work is well worth it.
Yes. Now, talk about the state of mind, your state of mind when you're writing. Does it vary from day to day, or do you try to approach the blank screen or blank page with a particular mindset?
It's two different things, and that's another good question. One, if I'm creating, in other words, I've got my outline, I'm up to chapter 4, and this is where these things are going to take place to get us to chapter 5. But I have no idea what's actually going to happen and what the people are going to say. To me, that's almost it's sort of a Zen state of allowing creativity to come through you. Think of the line, think of the picture, think of the scene. And then with luck, on good days, it comes. Then there's the other days where I'm now on chapter 15, and I have to look back at what I've done and start rewriting it and editing it. And there you're more, to me, it's more like a carpenter. You're so going through it, making sure the 2x4s are in place, that you've got the nails where they ought to be, and that you haven't overbuilt. And so those are two different mindsets. The first is not to be too much purple prose about it, but the first is almost like magic to me. It's like when you start writing a book and things just start coming together, ideas that are just flowing through you. And the other is more similar to being a lawyer, where you're really working on a very, very direct sort of analytical way to make sure that everything's working, that it reads well, and that it accomplishes what it needs to accomplish to entertain the reader.
So if you could go back in time, what would you tell a 25-year-old Scott Lord by way of advice?
A lot of things that don't have to do with writing, Mike. But
and it wouldn't have to do with writing. Just although that, obviously we're talking about your writing. So either way.
I I was pretty tightly wound, and I think that in a way served me well in terms of getting through law school and learning the craft of being a trial lawyer, which is like another 10 years before you really feel like you know what you're doing in a courtroom. I guess I would tell 25-year-old Scott Lord that try not to worry so much and try to have a little more fun because it's you do want to get somewhere, you do want to make your mark, and you want to achieve what it is that you set out to achieve. But as many people have said, you want to have some fun along the way.
Yeah, I get it. I get it. How has the writing experience changed for you over time, Scott? Or has it not changed? I mean, has it always been the same process? What is your process, by the way? Are you a morning writer or an evening writer? Do you do the word count thing? Do you just say it's 2 hours a day or 4 hours a day? What's your regimen like?
I'm a morning writer. For whatever reason, I get up, have my cup of coffee, eat a little something, and I try to get right to writing. And on a good day, I think I go maybe 4 hours. I find if I go much beyond that, then really if in terms of being creative, I might get a little worn out. The afternoons are terrific for rewriting, for going back and doing the editing process I was mentioning, the sort of carpentry, if you will, of writing. So definitely morning writing for the creative things, afternoons for other things.
Do you have silence in the room? Do you listen to music while you're writing?
I love music, but I can't listen to it while I'm writing. I know some writers do, and they find it inspirational. It's distracting to me. So yeah, I try to have it as quiet as possible. Hopefully not too many neighbors' dogs barking or too many leaf blowers going. But yeah, quiet is a good thing.
Tell us about a lesson you learned along the way that was significant to you, a writing lesson.
Yeah, you've stumped me a bit, but I'm thinking about the process of telling a story from one character's point of view as opposed to multiple points of view. It's a little bit technical, so I won't spend too much time answering you. But as the logic bomb, for instance, was in the first person, and Come November is in the third person. And basically, that's the difference between the writer, or excuse me, reading a book where the main character is narrating the book and it's a lot of personal references and a lot of inner thoughts, or third person where it's you, the author, and then I guess the reader looking at the character a little bit from the outside. And so it's sort of a technical thing, but one of the things that was stressed when I was going through classes, and also editors have been very good at teaching me about, is the idea of making sure that the point of view, whether it's in the first person or the third person, is consistent. Because one thing, and when you read bad writing, and certainly there's a fair amount of that around, is it's confusing if you don't have a consistent point of view in the book. It can vary from chapter to chapter, but in the middle of a scene, you don't want to be jumping from one character's head to another character's head, because it becomes confusing to the reader and harder for them to understand what's actually going on. Now, I know there's, like every rule, there are authors, brilliant authors, who break that rule and do it marvelously. But for me, if talking about a lesson, that really was an important one I learned over the years of taking classes, working with other writers, and working with editors.
Yeah, yeah. What are you streaming and watching on Netflix and other premium networks these days?
I fell in love with this series called Wild Horses. I think it's on Apple TV. It's Gary Oldman as a sort of dissolute old English spy. So it's a little bit in the Jean Le Carré realm, with this ragtag group of people who've sort of been kicked to the curb by the spy agency, but end up, as you might think, getting involved in very interesting cases, and eventually being able to solve them and resolve them in a way that's satisfying, if not at least to me as the consumer of those. Gary Oldman, of course, is terrific. The other actors in the show are equally as good. And I just saw that they're just starting the third season. So that's my current fave.
One of the most gratifying things about watching Netflix and Apple TV and so on is that so often there's just so many of those shows that are based on novels. Yeah. And it's opened up a broader venue for writers than existed before. It just seems to be that they're pilfering from the publishing industry all the time, happily so. But there's just so many of these shows. I don't know if that one is based on a novel, but there's certainly just dozens and dozens of them. So it's just a great thing.
Yeah, it's as someone who grew up reading a lot and still a very avid reader, it's always a sort of exciting, but you approach it with some trepidation when they have a screen version of your favorite book. And of course, in a 2-hour movie, it's a lot harder to present that than it would be in a multi-part series, and that's a real pleasure. Even the television versions that they've done of Jane Austen novels are really terrific because they can spend time with all the characters. They don't try to cut it down to 2 hours, which is of course just impossible. And when it's well done, can be very satisfying and to me gives you a chance to enjoy a book that maybe you've read once or twice or more, and in a new way.
And again, to our listeners, scottlord.com will take you there. If you look in the episode notes, I've got it there as well. Scott, congratulations on the new novel, and thank you for coming on the program.
Oh, thanks so much, Mike. It's been a real pleasure.